Well, today I'm joined by Dr. Bret Alderman. And Bret, you are an author and a life coach with a PhD in depth psychology. And we first met a couple of years ago through Critical Therapy Antidote.
Mhm.
And I am really delighted to have the chance to talk with you because I think that there's just in you sent me a PDF of your book, and I've had a chance to look it over, but I'm not to dig into it the way I really want to when I get a physical copy of it. um, it's fascinating, the things that you're drawing together. And
Mm.
I'd like to ask you some things about your new book. But first, would you mind saying a little bit about your own background and your work?
Sure. Well, and I'm so glad we're finally doing this because we've talked about talking, and this is wonderful to finally be here. I was born in Seattle, Washington, went to college at the now infamous Evergreen State College, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And there I got sort of a little bit interested and averse to things postmodern, which kind of sent me down a long rabbit hole of speculation and thought and thinking about certain um, postmodernist tendencies. And eventually that resulted in my doctoral dissertation when I went back to school many years later at the Pacifica Graduate Institute. And then I rewrote the doctoral dissertation into my first book. And that dissertation was largely around three different figures. One is Michel Foucault, which I'm sure you're familiar with. He's kind of the granddaddy of queer theory and a lot of things postmodern. But then I also talked about the American philosopher Richard Rorty and the founder of deconstruction, who's Jacques Derrida. And so that kind of got me down the current path that I'm still on, that's now evolved into a second book where I'm looking at kind of some similar trends. Um, yeah, I don't know if that was a good
Yeah, no, that's great. I didn't
clear.
realize you'd gone to Evergreen, and I
Yeah,
didn't remember that you were from Seattle. So that's really
yeah.
interesting. Was what was your impression of your education that you got at Evergreen? And I'll say before I heard, well, I guess it was before all the stuff happened in,
Hmm.
what was it, 2017, 2019, whenever it was that ever, I should know this, I should ask Benjamin this, but whenever that kerfuffle happened that made them hit the national news,
Yeah,
I knew Evergreen grads and I thought they were quirky. I thought it sounded like a really kind of hippie
yeah.
school, a little
Oh,
bit
yeah.
different. And so you said that you went there and then you took some time off and then you went back to school. So it sounds like
Yeah.
this is a little more distant. We're talking at least a decade or so back.
I graduated Evergreen in 92.
92. Okay, so several decades back. And
Yeah.
now, what was your impression of that educational style? Did you feel like you got a quality education?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
do. I loved Evergreen. I
Hmm.
mean, the Evergreen that I know from back then was a place where if you had real intellectual curiosity
Hmm.
and if really liked doing good work, you could do it.
Hmm.
Um, I feel really thankful for the education that I was given there. It also makes the whole, kerfuffle, to use your word, all the more painful because, I think once upon a time it was just a stellar institution. I mean, if
Hmm. Hmm.
if you were the type of person who could really take advantage of it, because you could really, you know, uh, investigate the different intellectual trends or fields that you wanted to. You were pretty much forced to write about them and articulate your thoughts about what you were studying. It wasn't rote learning. It was
Hmm.
really was learning how to think and learning how to think both critically and creatively.
Hmm. So it's like
Yeah.
supportive autodidacticism almost with a mentorship quality.
Yeah, I mean, there was that in terms of like autodidactic, you could do what was called, I think it was called an independent contract
Mm-hmm.
independent study where you could, and I did, I mean, I did a
Mm-hmm.
full semester where I was just studying the work of Milan Kundera, the
Mm-hmm.
Czech novelist, and all of his influences. So I got to read Kafka and Cervantes and Herman Brock and you know all these wonderful writers, and then read Kundera, and then you know write about him and the other authors that he was influenced by, and it was a wonderful experience. But then also you could take more structured formal classes where you were, you know, in seminars where you'd have, you know, 20 different people and you'd really hash out ideas
Mm-hmm.
in a way that I think is probably utterly foreign to a lot of people these days. Because I mean, we're at a point where you can't get 20 people in a room giving their honest take on an idea and also taking constructive criticism from others. That would be, I mean, there would be a scandal just waiting to happen there, you
Yeah.
know? So,
Yeah. Well,
so
that
yeah.
sounds really, it sounds like a really great way to be able to develop your own y- intellectual interests and sort of carve out your own path educationally and philosophically while also being supported institutionally.
Yeah.
I mean, it
Yeah.
sounds really wonderful.
It was.
Is there any reason why you think that that structure was particularly vulnerable to what happened later? Or is it just a tragic coincidence?
Um, yeah, I mean, I do think I do think there, I mean, there was the students always gave feedback on their professors, and the professors would give feedback on the students. There were no grades, so you'd get this, you know, page and a half or 2 pages, sort of a thorough description of what you did well, what you did poorly. And I
Mhm.
think those were better than grades and really, really
Mhm.
a great thing. But then you also have the students doing that to the professors, which
Okay.
I think sounds nice, but you know, an 18 or 19-year-old criticizing his, you know, 45-year-old professor who's got a PhD and decades
Mhm.
of study, I think
Yeah.
it sets up a power dynamic that probably as time went by became more and more exaggerated to the point where, you know, the students can just cancel and oust two super quality professors like
Yeah.
Brett Weinstein and Heather Hine. So, you know,
Yeah, I can see that. It sets up sort of a perverted incentive structure.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, well said.
Well, that's really interesting. And so your background, excuse me, sounds like you really dug into a lot of literature. So the history of human thought and the literary art form. And then at some point you wanted to go into the study of psychology.
Yeah, so I mean, when I was at Evergreen, because they let you dabble in a lot of different things, that's exactly what I did. So I, you know, at Evergreen, I got to read Jung and I got
Mhm.
to read, you know, did I read Freud? I think I read Freud back then too. And I did a full semester looking at anti-psychiatry and radical therapy. So I was looking at
Oh,
people like
interesting.
Thomas Sage, who was a big critique of the very idea of mental illness. And I
Oh,
was looking at
interesting.
R.D. Laing, who was like this really kind of avant-garde um, uh, psychiatrist who wanted to kind of build different types of institutions for mentally ill people, and was also sort of questioning, you know, what is this thing called mental illness?
Mhm.
And well, even Michel Foucault was one of the people that I would kind of lump in that category of, you know, the people that I was looking at. Um, So I had, I got a lot of background in psychology and the critique of psychology, which I think is really a good thing um, to have. But then I was also looking at, Eastern European fiction, and I got to do that. And then I was getting little smatterings of, postmodernist philosophy, Heidegger and Foucault and, some of these guys that would later kind of get under my skin and sort of get me really wanting to take them apart and sort of kind of battle with them a little bit.
Mm. And that's what you were able to do in your first book, I as I
Yeah, I was
take it,
able
yeah.
to do it in my first book and then
Mhm.
perhaps even more so in the second book. Yeah.
So as you started to, this is really interesting that as you were studying psychology, you were also studying arguments against psychiatry, psychology. And so
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
did that inform your path to studying the formal study of psychology in graduate school
Um,
and your trajectory in terms of career and how you wanted to work in that within that field?
yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Um, I think it informed my study because, in the background, I always understood that the discipline of psychology can be questioned like any other discipline. Um, it's not something that you just have to passively ingest,
Mm,
when you're shown Maslow's hierarchy or, whatever, to take a
yeah.
hypothetical example, you don't have to just say, oh, okay, that's how it works. You
Yeah.
can definitely say, well, no. And
Hmm.
like, where does this come from? And
Hmm.
who's this guy Maslow? And,
Hmm.
like, so it gave me that sort of critical sense, which was great. Um, and as far as my graduate studies in psychology, I didn't get a clinical degree, and there were various reasons for that. But part of it was I wasn't so much interested in psychology proper. I was kind of interested, and still am, in the places in between.
Mm,
Like this is what I love about Jung too, is I mean, Jung is probably more known to people in like comparative religious studies than he is to your average psychology student. That might be an exaggeration, but he was very much interdisciplinary. And
mhm,
so you read Jung, you're learning little bits about Kant, and then you're learning a little bit about, Chinese Taoist philosophy, and I love that sort of expansive interdisciplinary vision that he has. And I kind of have that too. And so really when I was getting my graduate degrees in psychology, my intention was to teach. I wanted to teach in
mm,
some sort of an interdisciplinary environment, much like Evergreen.
mhm,
And that actually never ended up happening,
mm,
but that was the original impulse.
mm. So you haven't yet had an opportunity to do that.
On my resume, there are a few courses I was technically an adjunct faculty who
Mhm,
taught a few courses, but it was a situation where I was working at a high school and they had some classes that were intended to give college credits to the high
mhm.
school students.
Okay.
So I taught those classes in a high school. They got college credits, but I never, it, it was not the experience of teaching at a
Mhm,
college. It was nothing like I had hoped of doing, but technically,
mhm,
sure, I've taught
mhm.
college.
Well, and writing books seems like providing an education as well. You're putting your thoughts together in a way that other people can learn from the things that you've learned,
Yeah.
and then also read your analysis of it and kind of go with you. It's a very deep sort of education in a personal, intimate way. And also you work as a life coach. So I'm
Yeah.
interested in hearing about your practice there. And that's like a one-on-one teacher in a lot of ways. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in some ways. So because in part because I wasn't able to use my degree in the way that I had hoped in academia,
mhm.
um, I I opened up a practice as a life coach,
Hmm.
um, which really does allow me to use my background in psychology and, in effect, do, if not psychotherapy, certainly it's a practice that's psychotherapeutic.
Hmm.
So I'm using a lot of what I learned. I'm using a lot of the same techniques that I think a good therapist would use.
Hmm.
Um, and so I'm definitely drawing from my background in education in the practice. And in some ways, I think it could not have come at a better time because, as you probably know better than, well, you do know better than many, many people. There's, I mean, a lot of people just getting really disillusioned with what's being called therapy. They're
Hmm.
not feeling like it's particularly therapeutic. They're feeling like it's been hijacked.
Yeah.
And so, people see my background and they say, okay, well, this guy can do what I'm really looking for. And we don't have, we can call it life coaching,
Hmm.
whatever,
Hmm.
as long as it works, as long as it helps me, lead a more meaningful life. This is what I care about.
Hmm.
Um, so, yeah,
I was, I know I mentioned this to you, but when we first met, it would have been through CTA, critical therapy antidote meetings that
yeah,
we were joining around sometime in 2020. And I was inspired by what you were doing. And I was already sort of feeling like I was just learning to articulate my concerns about what was going on. I knew something was wrong with the way that I was being taught in my school, and I was connecting with other people and learning that there was something going on at a larger level, and learning that, uh, I guess, developing this concern about the institutional profession of psychotherapy as it stands right now, and the education of students as well.
hmm,
Seeing someone who was doing something that was sort of therapy adjacent,
yeah,
and like you say, it is therapeutic. What is therapeutic? That is very individualized. What does that mean to any one particular person?
yeah,
It's not
yeah,
really something that you can put a license on.
yeah.
But it was really inspiring to me to see you doing that.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. And I don't know if it's just my imagination, but I'm seeing also more licensed therapists who are calling themselves life coach.
Yeah.
Um, so there's some overlap and some merging and some interesting shifts that are happening in that area as people just look for different ways of
Hmm.
feeling better about life, I guess. Yeah.
Hmm. I'm seeing that as well. And I think some of it is because people got accustomed to the idea of virtual sessions during
Mm,
COVID when everybody
yeah,
was doing so much online work.
yeah.
And still, a lot of therapists want the opportunity to practice with people at a distance, but their licenses don't allow it. And so they
Yeah.
can practice as a coach, and they're not limited geographically in the same way. But then there's also people who are taking aspects of their practice outside of the clinical space and working in ways that they can be a little more creative or a little bit less
Hmm.
limited in terms of the kind of relationships they can form, and feeling like this licensed clinical practice sets limits that they're not comfortable with, or creates barriers that concern them.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, One of the barriers and some of the limits uh, that come to my mind is just the very idea of um, diagnosing.
Mhm.
And I actually watched your recent talk with Joshua Slocum, who,
Mhm.
I'm a big fan of Joshua's. And of course, this is a theme that he talks a lot about.
Mhm.
But I mean, what really strikes me is that if you focus too much on a diagnosis, you kind of lose the story behind it. A diagnosis is a little bit like almost like a literary genre. It's like,
Mhm.
okay, you can say that the book is a crime thriller. That'll
Mhm.
tell you a little bit about it, but it's no substitute for reading the book and knowing the story, which is something kind of what you're doing in therapy and coaching, is like really getting at the story and getting at, kind of what's really meaningful
Mm,
for the person that you're talking to,
mm,
and having a diagnosis of, bipolar or, OCD is okay. I mean,
mhm.
that's useful, good, but it's not, it only gets you so far.
I love that metaphor. I think that's really brilliant. I can see how it creates a tendency to overemphasize category or genre, as you say, not only within the therapeutic relationship, but also in the identity of the individual going forward.
Yeah. I've been actually kind of keeping that in my pocket. I was wanting to tweak that genre
Yeah.
diagnosis comparison, but you're the first. I finally blurted it out somewhere.
Well, I love it. And I look forward to the tweet.
Yeah.
No, it's great. It's a good way to look at it. I do think that that's one of my concerns around diagnosis. It's not just the way that the bigger picture might get dismissed in therapy, but it's the way that it can be taken in to a person's self
Yeah.
and help to construct something that we're building ourselves around now,
Right.
rather than seeing ourselves as the complex person that we are, despite whatever aspects of that might be categorized in different ways to another or as a part of a larger pattern.
Yeah. This kind of gets me back to what we were talking about earlier when I said I was looking at radical psychiatry
Mhm,
or anti-psychiatry and radical therapy when I was at Evergreen, and just
mhm,
developing a critical view towards the discipline of psychology. I mean, that was the type of thing that I was beginning to think about. It's like, okay, well, what's a diagnosis? And you start to, think of the history of the DSM and how the diagnoses keep changing. And then you
mhm,
start to look at, like, what's the relationship between the DSM and the pharmaceutical community, or
mhm.
I shouldn't call it a community, the farm industry.
Industry, yeah.
Um, and then you start to think, well, and how much, I mean, how much is this kind of invented or created illnesses, and how much are the labels just sort of accurately representing things that people just go through, and so we need a label to affix them,
Mhm,
fix to them. So,
mhm,
I mean, it helped me kind of start thinking in terms of, these questions that,
mhm.
yeah.
Mhm. No, I think that's a really that tying that into the insurance and pharmaceuticals and this what is the utility of these categories that we call diagnoses? And certainly there's some utility for mental health providers. Certainly there is.
Yeah.
And yet is that water being muddied by other interests? And when I was in graduate school. And I've talked about this before. So I say that a lot because I feel like these same themes keep coming up and I don't want to
Yeah.
bore people by hearing aspects of my story over and over again. But I'm curious to know how I want to discuss them further. And especially when I have the opportunity to talk with someone like yourself who has the perspective that you have on this, I'd like to present it to you and see what you think about these things. And um, we I studied diagnosis and treatment. And then I studied in a number of other classes where diagnosis would be a part of your case conceptualizations. The theme that kept happening was, well, first of all, you'd use another student as your subject. We would take turns being client and provider in throughout during these labs or these what do you want to call them, hypotheticals, and you'd bring actual problems. So they'd say bring something from your real life that you can discuss and actually work through with the student provider, the student therapist. And a theme that kept coming up was, if you can't diagnose this person, tell your professor, because we can find you a diagnosis. We will find, if
Mm.
you can't identify the diagnosis that you would give, a diagnosis is required, because when you're in practice, it will be required in order to get reimbursement.
Yeah.
And so bring your difficult to diagnose client to your professor and go over it together, and the professor will find you a diagnosis. And so there's this idea that each of us, as soon as you set foot into the provider's office, if you're seeing a clinical mental health worker, you have a diagnosable mental disorder. You have something that is diagnosable, every single one of you. And so, so I'd like to get
Mm.
your thoughts on that.
Well, a really strange idea came to me kind of out of left field, but I thought of this idea in critical race theory,
Mhm.
where you assume the
Mm,
existence of racism in every interaction.
right.
You don't ask, is racism happening? You assume that it
It's
is,
how is it
and then you
happening?
find yes.
Yeah.
And so in this same thing, it's like, okay, there is a
Uh-huh.
diagnosis, there
Yeah.
is a malady, an illness, and I just have to find out where it is and what to call it and call it out. Um,
That's interesting. Yeah, I
yeah,
can
that one
see
came to
that.
me out of left field.
No, that's really interesting. And another thing that came up, this is kind of, so that's on the side of maybe overdiagnosing for the purposes of reimbursement or for the
Yeah,
purposes of having to use some kind of official form in which you see clients. So we see everybody the same way. We always give a diagnosis.
yeah,
On the other hand, there was an emphasis on underdiagnosis. We were told over and over, these diagnoses stay with people for a long time. So if there's a lighter diagnosis, like maybe instead of this mood disorder, give them an adjustment disorder.
uh-huh,
So there was these are going to stay on these people's records. So if at all possible, go on the side of the lighter diagnosis. So an awareness that there's this weight that goes with carrying a diagnosis. So I thought this was interesting. There are different reasons. Instead of seeking the best way to describe what's happening for this person
exactly.
for itself,
Yeah,
we're acknowledging that there are other motivations at play. And I became really uncomfortable with that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you said it well, rather than just being there and trying to see what's happening, what's real.
Mhm.
You have to take in all these other considerations that and it's interesting. So I mentioned Thomas Sage before, who
Mhm.
was kind of a libertarian um, critic of the very idea of mental illness.
How do
Now,
you spell his last name?
oh, it's crazy. And I think it's SZAZ. That might be wrong, but
Okay.
it's
Some
a
I'll look it up.
yeah. But he just rejected the very idea of mental illness. And I don't share his views, but I think they're in many ways compelling. His take was, look at, if you can't find a biological anomaly, if you can't find that there's something wrong with the physical body, you have no business using the word illness.
Mm,
And so if if there's something amiss in a person's thinking or feeling, you address it as that.
mm,
And so you might counsel them in the way that an elder or a or clergyman or just a counselor would do. But to say that it's illness is just mistaken. Now, I don't, I would not, I don't share that view, but I think it's a good one to keep in mind. It's like, why are we calling this illness?
mm,
Like, in what way is it an illness? Is that the right way of framing this psychological distress?
mhm.
You know?
That's really interesting because it puts most it it seems like that would indicate that most mental or behavioral disorders would be in the realm or would be addressed in the realm of philosophy or education rather than
Yeah.
this medical framework, something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. So I wanted to also ask you or see if you had some time to talk about your new book, which has
oh
a
yeah.
really intriguing title, in Eternal Youth and the Myth of Deconstruction. Would you say a little bit more about that title and then about what the book is about?
Absolutely. Um, so I should probably start by trying to define two of the main terms in that title. I'll start with deconstruction. Um, I know a lot of people have heard that word. It's become fairly common to say, well, you can just deconstruct that, take it apart. But originally, deconstruction in the strict sense of the word is a sort of literary philosophical form of analysis that was developed by a guy named Jacques Derrida, who's a French-speaking philosopher who was really, really influential. I think he has to be one of the 2 or 3 most influential, prominent people who we consider postmodern in their approach. He's kind of along there with Michel Foucault. In fact, he was the student of Foucault, and they had some fierce disagreements at times. But at any rate, I want to pull up on my computer a single quote. It's only one sentence, and it comes from Barbara Johnson, who wrote an introduction to Derrida's book, Dissemination, because I think it will give a really good snapshot of both what Derrida developed and kind of this more popularized attitude or ethos of deconstruction that I think is really, really prevalent today. And yeah, so the quote says, deconstruction reads backwards from what seems natural, obvious, self-evident, or universal in order to show that these things have their history, their reasons for being the way they are, their effects on what follows from them, and that the starting point is not a natural given, but a cultural construct, usually blind to itself. So it's this sort of approach that says, as soon as you see something, you think that's just self-evident. It's just the way things are. It's just natural. It's given. It's universal. It says, well, no, 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 no. That's not the case. It's actually something we created. And so they tend to, anyone who's working from a deconstructive viewpoint, whether they know it or not, tends to privilege culture and language over nature and, let's say, immediate perception.
That's really interesting. And as you were reading that, and as you're talking about it, one of the parallels that I saw right away is the idea of introspection, that we take ourselves as whole, but through looking at why we are the way we are, we can find that maybe the roots for the way that we've developed certain patterns are actually in the. And so I know this is a different thing, but it seems like there could be good in deconstruction, and then maybe a bias within it that's not there's something there. You're still doing something that's sort of a almost there's a theory there. It's not unbiased.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right to point that out. And I try to frequently come back to that idea that there's something of value here, even while I'm fiercely taking it apart, because I am a pretty fierce critic. But one of the things that I do like to do is always find, well, what is the point of value and what is the utility, and tip my hat to that, because without it, your critique is incomplete. So in the case, I mean, I think there is a real value in saying, well, how much of what I'm seeing here is the result of just the particular culture that I've been born into, the particular language that I speak. How much are those things forming my perception of things? To what degree can I just maybe let go of those? Is that even a possibility? I mean, these are really important questions to be able to ask, but that's different from assuming that the thing is not natural, not self-evident, not given. And when you're doing that, something else is going on. I
Mhm.
would say that, to use kind of Jungian language, um, you're archetypally possessed. You're
Mm.
already assuming a default position, and unable to to assume any other position,
Mhm.
and that's the danger, right? Um, it's yeah, so,
Mhm. Mhm. You're biased by your own theory.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. And so you're kind of deconstructing deconstructionism.
You're not the first person who said that to me. I don't phrase it that way, but fair enough. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, in some ways I'm using some of its own tools
Yeah.
against itself. Sure.
Which seems only right. If
Yeah.
you ask me, but
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting.
So the other key word in that title of the book is eternal youth.
Mhm.
And eternal youth is or often Jungians will say puer aeternus, which is just the Latin for eternal youth, um, it's a figure that Jungians and archetypal psychologists talk about quite a bit. And we tend to talk about it in two different ways. On the one hand, it's a mythological figure, and examples of this might be Icarus, who famously
Mm.
flew too close to the sun. His wings melted and he fell down to a tragic death. Um, Another example from literature would be Peter Pan, which I like to use that example a lot because it's so well known. And in both of those cases, it's a figure who doesn't reach maturity. In the case of Icarus, he dies when he's very young. In the case of Peter Pan, it's a boy who just remains 9 years old forever because he lives in a place called Neverland.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so when you and then the other way that we tend to think of the eternal youth is we think of actual living people who are kind of possessed by a similar pattern. And so this might be the 50-year-old who still hasn't quite found what he wants to do with his life.
Mhm.
you know
Mhm.
there's a feeling like he's not yet reached maturity, not and also not yet in real life. He's got sort of, or I'm saying he, it's also she, but um there's a feeling of arrested development,
Mhm.
like they haven't really been able to fully reach maturity. They're eternally young,
Mhm.
which can have kind of a dark side to it if
Mhm.
that means really never manifesting um, your own uh, maturity in real
Right.
life, so to speak. Yeah.
Like the idea of the the difference in the sound of young versus immature.
There you go. Yeah.
Totally different connotation.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, and so before I mentioned that term puer aeternus, and that root word puer, we also get the word puerile or puerile,
Mhm.
which is kind of like a derisive. It's kind of a little bit
Mhm.
like you're
Mhm.
being a bit infantile. So it has that connotation of younger than is appropriate or
Mhm.
should
Mhm.
be. Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting.
So in the book, I basically I read Jacques Derrida and this basic attitude of deconstruction as kind of a variant of like a Peter Pan story, because I think there's a sense I get in which both Derrida and the other philosopher that I really look into, which is Judith Butler,
Mm.
um, I get the sense that both of them are sort of cases of arrested development in a certain way. And a lot of the themes that are really prevalent in their work are also really prevalent in all of the literature about eternal youths. And so the book is an attempt to draw the parallels between those two seemingly very different, disparate things of like Peter Pan and then like postmodernist philosophy.
That is, I'm so fascinated. I have a million questions and I don't even know where to start, but I'd love to hear more about how you have drawn that comparison.
I'm kind of taking a deep breath
Yeah.
because, you know,
Where to start?
where to start. And I tell you, even writing about this is challenging in part, I mean, for a few different reasons. One is that Derrida and Judith Butler are such incredibly difficult writers. Just wading through their books and trying to make sense of it all, and furthermore articulate that sense in a way that I can later use to compare to these sort of mythological figures. It's a challenge even in writing, and it's even more of a challenge in trying to say all of that in the context of a particular, conversation.
And on that, how have writers who have been so obscure, whose writing is so difficult to parse, gained so much traction?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, and it's part of what motivated the book. And my answer is that they're telling a story that's appealing, that has a deep psychological appeal. And it's a story that's been around in some form or another for a very long time. So they sort of, they're telling an archetypal tale.
Mm.
I think the best example of this, and the best way of drawing parallels, might be to kind of shift a little bit to Butler. And I want to compare Judith Butler, who I think a lot of your listeners will be kind of vaguely familiar with. She's the person who talks about, gender as performance, gender performativity. She's the kind of one of the leading figures of queer theory. I want to compare her to Peter Pan, I think, in a way that might make things clear. So Peter Pan lives in a place called Neverland. And in Neverland, time doesn't pass. And to pretend to be something and to actually be that something, it's the same thing. The pretend and the real are the same thing. This is the basic thesis of not only the character of Peter Pan. Like, he's the one character in that whole story who can't really differentiate between what's pretend and what's real. There's a scene in Peter Pan that I love in which he is pretending to eat food. So it's imaginary food, but he literally grows fat.
Mm.
And so there's that weird sort of confusing conflation of the imaginary and the real, right? Judith Butler's whole theory about gender performativity, if you really kind of tear away all of its academic attire and kind of, I would say, pseudo-intellectual, sophistry, it really amounts to the same thing. I mean, her thesis really is what you perform, i.e., what you pretend, is what's real. And the act of performing makes it real. I mean, I couldn't see a clearer parallel. And that is the sort of and it's also the sort of the mentality of childhood, right? When you're young, it's like you live in a life of pretend, and you're supposed to be pretending. It's a way of practicing entering the real world, right? And I get the sense that both Butler and, in his own way, Derrida, kind of live in that realm of pretend, and they kind of don't make the return trip. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really, I love that. And I think that's a really great comparison. And as you're saying that, I'm also wondering, what is the proper conceptualization of these things, if we can even use a word like proper, because that, what is your foundation? What's the anchor? But so the world is structured based on agreements, systems, history, patterns. And if you here, this is, I'm so inarticulate about this, but like, for instance, yourself, you have forged a path for yourself that's different. You imagined it different, and so it became different for you in a way. You went to a school that offered a lot of creativity. You studied this thought and this thought as its opposite, and you form a pathway for your life that isn't rigidly bound by the structures around you, and yet somehow you are still anchored into the structures and into the systems and the patterns.
Wow.
And so this Butlerian or Neverland kind of, you're in the fantasy realm forever. What's the proper balance of the two, between forming your own thoughts and so they making them manifest, and living according to the strict patterns around you? Am I making any sense at all?
You're making some sense, but I'd like to hear even a little bit more.
Okay. Okay. So if it's youthful and immature to imagine that something can be just because you want it to be, use your imagination, it's food, let's pretend like it's food, then there's sort of a hollowness to that. There's no underpinning. What is reality based upon? You're creating it out of nothing, and eventually that's going to have to fall apart. But there's also something of the spirit of the entrepreneur or the visionary that embodies that as well. That has to have some of that imagination and that expansive-ness that says, what's happening right now, I see something else, and I'm going to, because I dream it, it will be. And I think a lot of people who have a lot of openness and energy for visionary kind of work embody that in a way that somehow is healthily ensconced in the structures of their time. And I don't know. I just, as you were saying that, I kind of wondered what your thoughts were on that. How do you see this as being an immature version of this? How is this Butlerian and Peter Pan a stunted and wrong version of something that might also have a place and a value?
So one of the ways that I address that in the book is through talking about a particular literary motif that I refer to as the magic portal. So, I mean, if you read The Lion, the Witch, and the wardrobe is the magic portal. You go, excuse me, you go from, what is it, 19th century England or London, I think, and you open up this wardrobe, and then all of a sudden you're in the land of Aslan, right? And the witch and all of this wonderful fantasy land, which is a land that, might be in some sense real, but it's not real in the sort of consensus reality sort of real. And I would equate that with kind of like what I'm talking about in terms of Neverland. It's a land of pretend, right?
Complete fiction.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And you can see that motif in a lot of different things. I mean, it's there in, The Wizard of Oz, where, it's kind of like the tornado is kind of like the magic portal that, brings her to Oz, where this is completely, again, it's like an imaginary fictional world. Or in Harry Potter, it's, a particular place where you get on a train. It's I don't know what, I don't remember right now, but it's like the 7.5 is like it's like a strange little portal that only
in
certain
an
people
alley or
know about,
something.
and that leads you to Hogwarts, um in the Never Ending Story, there's another, there's, I don't know if it's a book, but there's, in each of these stories, there's a particular way in which you can access like a wonderful world of the imagination. And oftentimes it is a world in which you can learn a great deal,
Mhm.
and it's a very valuable place to be able to visit. But in a lot of times in children's fiction, there's the question of the return, and there's also the question of
Mm.
what's real. In some stories, the longer you stay, um, like for example, in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the longer they stay in Narnia, the more they're asking, like, wait a second, what's real? Is it Narnia that's real, or is it that London place that I
Mhm.
vaguely remember?
Mhm.
Um, so there's the question of like what's real.
Mhm.
Um, and different stories kind of resolve this in different ways, but generally there is a return to kind of consensus reality, and then some variation of understanding that other world as being real, but real in a different way. Or sometimes it's more like, oh no, that was just fantasy. But, ideally, there's some sense of I learned something
Mhm.
there. Um, and I was able to bring it back. And so I think that's that. I mean, I don't know if that's a roundabout answer, but it's like I think in talking about it in terms of that literary genre and that idea of the magic portal, I try to sort of say that it's really important to go there.
Mhm.
It's really important to come back.
Mhm.
Otherwise, you're kind of stuck in Neverland, where you think if I just, act like a particular person, I'm magically that person and everybody else has to play along.
Mhm.
Last thing I want to say, because I just remembered it, that's another really fascinating aspect of Peter Pan, is that Peter Pan, the character, when he sees that other people aren't pretending along with him, he gets mad. Like
Mm.
he gets
Oh, yeah.
furious. It's
Mhm.
like you must play along with my fantasy or else. And I think we're seeing a lot of that these days.
Yes, absolutely. That really rings very true.
Yeah.
And it's, when you talk about that return, it's like a maturity arc. So
Yeah.
a stage in development.
Yeah.
So the return represents integration.
Yeah.
And so you're
Exactly.
talking about stunted, uh, a very articulate plea or theory that's coming out of the stage of development that is still in Neverland when we were talking about these theories. So they're just they're they're speaking from a place. It's like the student writing the narrative evaluation of the professor.
Mm,
I'm thinking of this from earlier in our conversation. The 19-year-old who is evaluating the 45-year-old educated
mm,
professor. And so you're getting a thesis written by someone of a specific developmental period.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really well said. And I think sometimes what makes it hard to see that is that they're so um seemingly intellectually advanced. I mean, that this is one of the things that really tripped me up for so many years is I would read someone like Derrida or read someone like Foucault, later, much later, read Judith Butler, and they're kind of intimidating. It's like they obviously have a wealth of knowledge in terms of like what the whole history of philosophy is, and they use a very sophisticated vocabulary, and their syntax and grammar is so complex that you can take that as, oh my God, they're brilliant and so sophisticated, and I don't understand them. It must be because they're so intellectually adept.
Mhm.
But two things. I mean, number one, that doesn't mean mature.
Mhm.
It means really developed in one particular area. And to be honest, the more you dig into the text, the more you realize that there's a lot of sort of techniques to make their thinking far more complex than what it needs to be, and that serves the purpose of avoiding criticism. If you
It's like
state
armor.
something, yeah. I mean, if I can come up with an argument that just loses you in its prose and its sophistry and its literary puns and its references and its, then what are you gonna say?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And and in talking about immaturity and development and develop statements from a particular developmental stage, I'm reminded of speaking with a young client, late adolescence, sometime back. This person said something about feeling like they get dismissed because they're just going through a stage. People will say, "Oh, this is just a stage," and this feeling of being dismissed is really painful based
Yeah.
on the stage. And as we were talking, I'm thinking about how all of life is just stages. We're just in stages the whole way through. And is there a stage at which we can be said to possess the truth for all other stages? And I think this is really interesting to think about in my own development, in my own life. I feel like the process of getting older, there's knowledge acquisition, there's experience acquisition, but a lot of the things that I feel like I've gained in terms of wisdom as I've gotten older is just a deepening of understanding of things that I think I already understood before. I can imagine me saying now to 20-year-old me a bunch of things that I think are important life lessons, and 20-year-old me saying, "Yeah, I totally understand that," but not understanding it at the level that I understand now. And certainly probably right now, I'm not understanding things. Should I live another 20, 40 years, I'll understand those things deeper. It's not so much that there is more, but I think deeper is the bigger message. And I wonder about that, like the stages of understanding throughout life. Does one possess truth more than another? Or is it just that it possesses more perspective?
I mean, I would argue yes to the first one. I think there are greater stages of development in which you know more. However, I want to, tip my hat to what you're saying, and I would just say that, okay, there's a difference between saying it's just a stage and it's a stage.
Yeah.
Okay. As soon as you say just, then it's a little bit reductive and a little bit dismissive, right? Yes. Let's say, playing with identity, thinking about identity. That is very much typical of adolescence. That is part of that stage. It's not exclusive to it by any means, So, I mean, it's not that the question of identity is just a stage, but at the same time, it seems to be really, really prevalent in that stage. And it's something that we might keep on developing, but in a deeper, more nuanced sense as we grow older. Yeah, so.
I feel like I have so many more things I'd love to explore with you. Thank you so much for going through this, and I'm really looking forward to reading the entire book. Do you have anywhere that you want to direct people? Where can they buy the book, and where can they find your work?
Well, you can buy the book on Amazon, of course. Eternal Youth and the Myth of Deconstruction. You can also buy it at the Routledge site. It appears in their series on philosophy and psychoanalysis, and I think you might get it a little bit cheaper there. And as we discussed, we'll put like links in the below so that people can both go to my coaching site and to, links to the book. And yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Bret. It's been a real delight to talk with you.
It's been fun. Thank you.
All right.